Welcome back to another week of Ideas in Progress here with the Institute for Humane Studies. We pick back up with Dr. David Beito, shifting this week from FDR's New Deal to a fascinating and challenging figure from the Civil Rights era, the enigmatic and larger-than-life T.R.M. Howard. All right, so David, welcome back. I want to start out this week by saying that I think it's fair to say that you and Linda Royster Beito are by yourselves responsible for the vast majority of people today who've heard anything at all about T.R.M. Howard. I mean, I know I, for example, would not have heard about him until your book came out, even though he seems like such a fascinating and important figure. I just had never come across his name before, and after having read your book, I'm a little surprised by that, because he certainly had a life that was larger than the normal one.
Well, we're still surprised, and we're still surprised by, even though we're happy with the reception to our book, and we'd like a lot more people to take an interest in this remarkable man, and really would like a lot more libertarians and maybe libertarianish conservatives to take an interest in him, because this is someone that, it's almost like a Randian hero in some ways. And he was not on the periphery of the civil rights movement. He was not a dissident in the movement in the sense of being, some sort of outlier. He was a leader. He was a key leader in the years before Martin Luther King. He was out there on the front lines doing things in very hostile environment that were really quite remarkable. So that is one thing I am a little bit surprised on, and a little bit still hopeful that more libertarians and more, of course, as people on the left as well, but more people that sort of agree with us will see what this guy has to offer, and what, and what in his importance in the whole history of civil rights, because we often tend to see ourselves, I guess, as that's not. That's something we have to, that's not really something that we're connected to, I guess, like the left is connected to the history of civil rights.
Speaking of that, which I think is a tragedy, by the way. I mean, oh, God, all the time I've tried to spend arguing that classical liberal scholars should be more connected to the history of race. I mean, good Lord, the state created this phenomenon in the first place, right here in Virginia. So, it shouldn't be that hard for us to deal with the history of race and racism, and to make serious interventions there into that literature. And, I'm wondering, what was it like writing a book that you must have known would sort of be the definitive biography of T.R.M. Howard, at least for the time being? What was that experience like?
It was something unplanned. I originally wrote a book about mutual aid, from mutual aid to the welfare state, which discussed the role of fraternal societies as providers of social welfare. And we had a chapter on a black hospital that was run by a fraternal group, and it was all black town in Mississippi. And my wife and I, we went there, and we were sort of doing some, she was helping me in the research. And then we both came across this guy, someone who was the local town father, said, someone should write about this guy. And we said, yeah, whatever. I wasn't thinking of writing a biography. My wife wasn't thinking of writing a biography. But once we looked into this guy just a little bit, we said, my God, this guy is incredible. And drop everything, write a biography of him. And I'd never written a biography before. We had not. And so it was a different experience. It was quite enjoyable writing a biography, because you're kind of controlled by this person's life. And so we would try to track him every year. What was he doing at this point? And who was he meeting? And what efforts was he making? And how was it all interconnected? A lot different than writing a typical history book. But fortunately, Howard was all over the place. It was all over black newspapers. There's an FBI file on him. He always stood out everywhere he went. So we found plenty of material. We found, of course, since he died in 1976, we found quite a few people that knew him. We hundreds of interviews of people that knew him. So we were able to tell the story. We started out now, a lot of those people are gone. And we would have lost a lot of the more colorful aspects of the book, I think. But we were lucky. Our timing was still good enough that we were able to tell his story, and we're pretty proud of the way it turned out. And of any book I've ever done and probably ever will do, this is the book that's my favorite, and that I'm most enthused about, and I think is the most important in some ways. If only other people agreed.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, because I'll say that three particular strands of Howard's life really stood out to me, and I wondered if I could get your commentary on sort of each one in turn. First was his role in the civil rights movement, of course, and as you said, even though he's overshadowed by a lot of other figures, he really was central. I mean, you almost want to call him sort of a Forrest Gump-like figure in the civil rights movement, except he wasn't tangential to this at all. He didn't just happen to be there at these big, important moments. He really was central to a lot of aspects of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, he was a leader. And, well, I mean, he built a mass movement in the most hostile part of the United States in terms of civil rights, which is the Mississippi Delta. I think that's probably a fair statement or close to it. There are whole counties in the Delta that that had black majorities and not a single black voter. So this is a place where, when you read about the history of the civil rights movement, a lot of the killings, a lot of the massacres, a lot of the violence, this is where a lot of that was centered. Here this guy comes in the 1940s. He's a chief surgeon of this fraternal hospital, though he's very much connected to this tradition of self-help and mutual aid. And he proceeds to become very wealthy, one of the largest black landowners in Mississippi, over 1,000 acres. Owns a construction firm, sets up a zoo. He's a real showman, a community builder. He's kind of the P.T. Barnum of civil rights. Has the first swimming pool for blacks. He just comes into this all-black town in the Delta that has its own interesting history called Mound Bayou, and he just remakes the whole place. And then he organizes a movement to boycott service stations that refuse to provide restrooms for blacks. I mean, forget about Jim Crow restrooms or segregated restrooms. They just didn't have them in a lot of gas stations in the Mississippi Delta, and he sets this up in 1950. And people put bumper stickers on their cars that say, "Don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom." 10,000 of these, at least. And it's a successful boycott, partly because the national chains get involved and put pressure, but also just because African Americans they'll pull in and I talked to one guy and he says, yeah, the guy put the gas nozzle in my car. And I was asking him, do you have a restroom for colored people here? And the guy said, no. And I said, take that out. And he drove off. Those kinds of things happened all the time. And most African Americans have cars at this time. So they go elsewhere, including the gas stations owned by African Americans. So it's a very successful boycott. He builds this movement called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. They have annual rallies where they get 10,000 people out in the middle of the rural Delta with national speakers such as Thurgood Marshall, entertainers such as Mahalia Jackson. It's like a festival, and he's doing all of this. And then most people have at least heard of the Emmett Till case, 14-year-old black boy who's visiting the Mississippi Delta. He's brutally killed, disappears. He's found floating in the Tallahatchie River, badly mangled. Howard is on this case even before they find the body. Emmett Till's mother comes to Mississippi to stay with him during the trial. He provides her an armed escort to the trial, and then he's out at midnight, 2 a.m, with a whole group, an interracial group of people, leading a search to try to find witnesses and evidence to hopefully convict these two white brothers who were guilty of the crime, but they ended up being acquitted. And Howard predicted that would happen, but he was desperately trying to prove their guilt, and he found plenty of proof, but the jury was not going to do anything. So these are the kinds of things he's doing, but he is Mr. Civil Rights for Mississippi, and he's a national figure. All the black newspapers, New York, Los Angeles, everywhere, they're putting him on the front page. And he's involved in the Montgomery bus boycott in an interesting way, which I could tell you
Go
about.
ahead, please.
Well,
yeah, please.
Only 3 days before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, Howard gives a speech in Montgomery on the Emmett Till case. And he gets a sellout crowd, at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. His host is an nationally unknown minister, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks is in the audience. It's a big event. It's on the front page of the local black newspapers. It's still on the newsstands. 3 days later, when Rosa Parks makes her decision to give up her seat, refuse to give up her seat, she said later, she was asked, well, who were you thinking of? She said, I was thinking of Emmett Till. And she also noted in an interview that she did that was the first big event that they had in Montgomery about the Till case, and Howard was a real passionate speaker, very effective. So, did that prod her? It's entirely possible. It's entirely reasonable. Of course, we don't have proof, but he's right there. So in some ways, it's a changing of the guard, because in the period after that, King rises up to become the best-known national civil rights figure, and Howard is still important, but this is one of the reasons I think people might like him. He doesn't define himself as a civil rights leader. He is a leading black doctor in the country, a leading businessman, big game hunter. He's a leading entertainer, raconteur. He's all these things, and he's always moving on. So he moves on to a new project. You ask him about Emmett Till 10 years after this, he'd say, oh, yeah. You want to hear my new thing that I'm doing? Right? Always moving on to new projects. That's why he's difficult. It was hard for us to find a title, because what is he? He's everything. And that's attractive about him. He's always looking forward, always planning, always coming up with a new project. Or often a new way to make money, but he's into community building. He's into improvement. He combines those two. He's not the Gandhian figure, right? He likes to have the good life. He likes to head down the highway in his very expensive Buick in the Mississippi Delta and change his clothes several times a day, the most expensive suits, and have fun, right? And live the high life. So he's in the civil rights leader in the fast lane, but he doesn't fit our stereotype. At least, I guess we hear things about King, but that wasn't his persona, right? Howard's persona is, I'm a guy here to have a good time and go to the races and bet on horses and dress well and be this kind of larger than life figure.
But now, of course, a black man in Mississippi who wants to live larger than life like that and put his sort of his wealth and success on display is really taking his life in his hands, especially if he's a civil rights leader. And that brings me directly to the second strand that I was really interested in, which is his support of an individual right to bear arms in self-defense. And I mean, this is not Howard forming up as part of some well-regulated militia, right? This is an individual right to bear arms that he's particularly involved with supporting. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, in some ways, he's involved in. Both would characterize him, because
well,
he is Howard is a Kentucky boy who hunted, very poor, unlike almost all these major leaders. He is born in true poverty. And the family literally just had to ration bullets. Here's the number of bullets you get, to the 7-year-old, 8-year-old boy, or whatever he was, very young. Go, go get some food for our family. That's how poor. So he grew up hunting. He knew guns. He was comfortable with them. He had an arsenal, including a Thompson submachine gun, which he would show off to people. And pistols, guns, but you also had gun control in Mississippi. You would often think the South, gun control, but they were a pioneer. In Mississippi, you could not get a gun if you were a black person for, what we call, concealed carry, or carry a handgun in your car. You couldn't get it. You'd be turned down because the local sheriffs were involved. So if you were a black man and were found with a handgun in your car, they would, you'd have to pay $100 or whatever, which is a lot of money in 1950s for carrying that's first offense, I guess, carrying a weapon without a permit. But Howard had a hiding place in his car. He had a secret compartment. So the police would pull him over, put the gun in the secret compartment, and they never caught him with a gun, but he was heavily armed. But the people around him at these rallies, these rallies of 10,000 people, no violence. Why? Because people there were heavily armed. This is the gun culture, black gun culture, rural black gun culture. And they had guns everywhere, and they had a very efficient security system. So if someone were to have come in close at one of those rallies and try to attack anybody, they would have gotten a fuselage of response. So he's very much into armed self-defense, and it's sort of part of their program. It's essential to their program, and it prevents a lot of violence. Certainly, he's in a violent place, but I'll have to say he's been economically successful. A lot of the whites, at least in the early years, were kind of afraid of him, because the story went around that if Howard didn't like what you were doing, strange things could start happening, right? Some of the workers on the plantation could break machines, could do other things like that. He had almost seen as a kind of mystical power. And at least in the early years, if things like at a bank once, women were referred to by their first names, which is typical in the Delta. The bank teller wouldn't say Mrs. Smith, Mamie, right? Howard heard about this and had a large account in that bank and said, I'll pull it out, and I'll tell other people to pull it out. The bank president called him up and apologized, and that practice ended. So he does have that economic clout. He buys a lot of stuff from whites. He buys their tractors, sells his crops to them. So under the radar, he has a certain amount of economic clout.
The final strand that I wanted to talk about here is Howard's career as an illegal abortionist.
Oh, you asked the question. Yes. When I'm on the, that's why I won't get on the Glenn Beck show. I mean, maybe there's other reasons, but Beck likes to talk about it. I try, but they see that and they go, we can have this guy on.
So
it's sad that people have that attitude, right? They can't take something they like and overlook something they don't like. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I think it's definitely part of the tapestry that makes this guy so compelling a figure, because he does support women's access to abortion because he sees the impact that early in life parenthood has on black women especially, but the black family in general, and he sees it as sort of a poverty trap.
He does, and we're not too sure how this all happened. He's a real independent figure. He comes from a very conservative religious background, Seventh-day Adventist, who are not anti-abortion, partly because their leader, what is her name, Ellen G. White, never said anything about abortion, but somebody told me if she had something, she would have been against it. But so they got a little leeway on that. But he comes from this kind of background, but then he starts performing abortions on the side, and he's doing them initially for white women. so he does this in Mississippi. Daughters of the white elite, and my God, he would have known he would have had a lot of blackmailable information if he wanted to use it. And it's never used against him. He would do these abortions, and he's attacked viciously in the press for his civil rights work and for other things. But they never touch this. But it was well known that this is what he's doing. It's a sideline, though. Now, when he comes to Chicago, in 56, he's doing it illegally. And they have a whole system, it's illegal in Illinois till the 70s. So he's doing it illegally, and he's arrested a couple times. And he hires very good lawyers. And one time, this lawyer, who, by the way, was the first choice of the Jack Ruby's family to represent Jack Ruby, he turns his case down. But he's a very nationally known lawyer named Bellows. Bellows says the police had sent a policewoman in to, quote, have an abortion, and to catch, she was wired, and to catch him in the act of doing the abortion. And they did. And he offered a bribe of like $10,000 to the police officer, who I interviewed, who, by the way, liked Howard. He said, I turned down the bribe, but he offered me. He's kept up in the number, and then Bellows uses this really novel defense. He says, "Well, she asked her, the policewoman, were you pregnant?" She says, "Well, no." He said, "Therefore, no crime occurred. She wasn't pregnant. Can't have an attempted abortion on someone that's not pregnant." And he gets on, and they never get him. And then when abortion is legalized, Roe v. Wade, he's ready to go the first day and sets up a major medical center on the South Side that gets a lot of its income from abortion. Now, whatever you think of Howard on that issue, he is very open about his views on this, and he is going against a strain of anti-abortion thought among blacks, people like Dick Gregory, people like Elijah Muhammad. There is a lot of African Americans who are making this sort of argument that this is genocide. And Howard is making an argument defending, a woman's right to choose, but he's making utilitarian arguments like you mentioned. He says, look, in the Mississippi Delta, you don't have anything to do. So people, have sex, right? And they do that for recreation. Right? There's nothing else to do. And so you have a lot of babies being born that aren't going to be taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. So he's trying to open this up. And he definitely is identified with that position. And he's shown on the cover of Jet magazine performing an abortion. And this is how much he's involved in that issue. And it is a shame that a lot of conservatives, who I think would almost see him as a folk hero, not all of them, but a lot of them, I think, are put off by that, because this would seem to be somebody that conservatives would want to embrace, but it's the red and team mentality. They can't say, well, gee, I don't agree with him on that, but, And the same thing with the left, I think, to some degree, too, who are put off by his materialism, by the fact he was a Republican, put off by his anti-communism, and he was very anti-communist, and that kind of thing. So both sides have something to like, but something about Howard that's going to get them upset, and that's unfortunate that people can't put that aside, but they can't. A lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, I found this the most interesting part of the whole book, this discussion of abortion, because it just shows how widespread his different contributions were, and how all the different intersections of parts of his personality amounted to a really interesting body of work.
Well, on abortion, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, of course, the most interesting figures from history are complicated, and Howard is certainly complicated, and he defies sort of easy categorization today, and he had a lot of flaws and drawbacks as well. And I know you had something to add there, but I think we would be remiss too if we didn't mention the kinds of hardships that he did inflict on those around him while he was so wrapped up in the things we've been discussing.
Well, Howard, of course, we're now finding things out about. I'm not trying to diminish Martin Luther King, but we're finding out things about a lot of people. So I think we have to keep that in perspective. But we did a warts and all approach. This is no hagiographic, book. And one of the things we saw about Howard was that he was married to the same woman for decades, 1935 until his death. Very interesting, very helpful to him, very different than him, very different background. But he was having affair after affair after affair, but not just affairs. I guess I don't know if he understood the principles of birth control. He probably didn't matter to him. He had, I lost count, 7, 8, what they call, maybe more than that. I haven't reviewed it in a while, but what they call in the South outside children, out of wedlock children. He was, it was just an incredible number. Now, Howard did not deny this, and and was involved in the lives of these children and employed them in many cases and helped them to go to college. But again, you can rationalize that to only a limited degree because these children are living with their mothers and are, have a many ways deprived background because there's only so much you can do, and they're all over the place. So he has these children outside of marriage. That's I would say that's the big thing about Howard. He's just sort of the lord of the manor, I think, and it goes to his head, right? Running this big plantation and and all of this stuff. And of course, in his job, he wasn't that great a looking guy, but he had all these opportunities and he used the opportunities.
Any last words for us on T.R.M. Howard?
Well, we're hawking around a movie script, so we got a few bites.
Ooh.
But if anybody has any contacts, let us know, because we think that the guy would really make for an incredible film, and would be as an actor, my God, I think a comedian would be good in this part. Maybe someone like Dave Chappelle or Eddie Murphy, because Howard does have that kind of, as I say, that quality of, we're going to put on a show, right? It's going to be big. It's going to be really big. And someone said once he could talk your shoes off in a snowstorm. So he's just as a personality alone, I think there's just so much about him. But he is a byproduct as well, and this is something else that I think classical liberals should take pride in, of a earlier tradition of self-help, of entrepreneurship, of mutual aid. He comes out of that tradition. He builds on that tradition. He's able to build a civil rights movement basically from the infrastructure created by a fraternal society that he ran, which has lodges throughout Mississippi. Well, he's able to use that. And those are people that are trained in how to run a meeting and in Robert's Rules of Order and in organizing it. He is a fan of Booker T. Washington. He calls Washington a towering genius, and you can understand why, because that was Washington's strategy. You build up the economic infrastructure, and then civil rights, you're going to have an infrastructure for civil rights. He lives that out, and I think he helps redeem. There's plenty of examples that Washington was right. As a long-term strategy, it paid off. And the modern civil rights movement really grows out of that infrastructure that's created by Washington's efforts. And to a great extent, obviously a lot of people are doing that, but Washington is encouraging that, certainly.
What a fascinating guy. T.R.M. Howard has got to be one of my favorite new people. Not that he is new, of course, but I simply never heard of him before I read the Beito's book. But obscurity aside, Howard was hugely important and still cuts quite the figure. His strengths and weaknesses both point the way forward, and for my part, I just want to note This is the kind of work I think we should be doing more of. Here it is, right here. Students, take heed. There's always more ground to cover and new ideas to put into progress.